I don't know what it says about you guys. You're going to come to a talk called Bite Me. I'll try to do my best to entertain you, maybe inform you too, but we'll see how that goes. So my lab, I guess we work on quite a few things, but I'm only going to tell you a little bit about it tonight. If you are one of these people and you sort of experience this situation where you've got this bad guy and then this thing that we all love, usually that's going to result in a situation that nobody really loves. And there's an enormous amount of research that goes into this, and most of the time when you're going to your doctor, you're trying to figure out how to get rid of this thing or that thing or both of them. But we really don't ask a lot, including biologists like myself. We don't ask a lot about when this doesn't kill you or just doesn't make you stronger. What happens to your contributions to this bad guy to everybody else that's around you? So how many of these other bad guys are you making when you've got the combination of this bad guy and stress? In other words, how many of your friends and neighbors and relatives are you infecting when you're stressed? Stress is clearly bad for us as individuals, but how much does it affect everybody else? So that idea of the ability to make bad guys, ability to make viruses, parasites in general for other things, we call competence. And I'm going to talk today about the work that my group does on competence for West Nile virus. So you can't live in Florida for very long without knowing what that is. It's a disease that affects lots and lots of birds. It's carried by a lot of different vectors, including quite a few you can find around here. It definitely affects people, but it's not the type of thing that in affecting people is sort of naturally that way. It spills over from its natural reservoirs, various different birds and a few other organisms, to affect us, to affect horses, cause big problems, but by and large, this is a disease of birds. So if we want to think about the implications of stress in us or stress in other animals for making disease for yet other animals, we want to try to focus on this concept of competence. It's something that's really gaining a lot of attention in the immunology world, and I'm going to define it in my bird-centric way of thinking about things as all the different components of being a bird that might influence how much of the parasite you have. So these little circles here is meant to be a virus. Whether when you're exposed to, say, a mosquito that carries it, likelihood you get it in you, how many more mosquitoes you're transmitting it to, and then how many more you're spilling that virus into the rest of your community. So what we're going to focus on today specifically is how adding on stress really changes that scenario to the extent at which it does. And there's reason to care about this. So you might imagine, for any non-ornithologist, that a bird is a bird is a bird is a bird. It doesn't really matter where you go, especially it doesn't matter whether we're talking about one robin versus another, one starling versus another, one sandhill crane versus another. They're all the same thing. But in fact, there's a lot of reason to believe there's huge diversity in how they're different impacting us. So for example, this is a study of a friend of mine, now 10 years old, asking about the relative commonness of a bunch of birds around DC and Baltimore. And it doesn't matter what the colors are. You don't even have to be an ornithologist today. It doesn't make a difference. But what's important here is that if you go out into those places and you just count the animals that are there, you get some breakdown like that. Across 5 different sites, some of them are really common, this black bar, some of them are really rare. But then you ask the mosquitoes what the mosquitoes there want to eat. All you got to notice is that there's a totally different color pattern. The birds that the mosquitoes prefer to eat tend to not be the most common birds. In other words, mosquitoes are looking for the tastiest birds, not just any bird. So that suggests that different species, and what we're going to talk about today is whether just different individuals have different competence and potentially spreading risk to other organisms. So here's what we're doing. We're going to ask whether this critter like this robin here, if we're thinking about robins, they all sort of collapse on this. Everybody is pretty bad. Maybe there's some that are really bad. Maybe there's some that are not so bad at all. But when we change the situation, when we add stress to these organisms, what happens to them? Do they become SpongeBob Super Sponge here? And for every parasite spilled out in the environment, these things just slurp them up, maybe protecting other organisms? Or does it turn around on its head? Anybody know Mary Mallon? Yeah. Typhoid Mary? A really fun lady, right? So whether or not the Typhoid Mary phenomenon is common enough and influenced by stress that we want to think about that. So really, to put it in a single question, what we're going to talk about tonight is whether stress can lead to super spreading. So this is how we do the work. These are really fun conditions. We get to put on the suits that you see in all of the movies. It's not quite that extreme, but it is a pain most of the time. We're working on one of the common things that transmits the disease, the vector southern house mosquito. We're working on the parasite, and we tend to work on this bird, which many of you can't see. It's called a zebrafinch. This is the same zebrafinch you're going to find in PetSmart and the other stores like that. We work on it for the same reasons that people have it as pets. It's really common. It's easy to work with. They breed like crazy. We can get a lot of animals to study. So what we're going to talk about today, and this is the only sort of biology, terminology, jargon type thing that I'm going to introduce to you, this molecule called corticosterone. We got a winner? So here's the 4 things we're going to do today with this special stress hormone called corticosterone. We're going to ask whether mosquitoes can key in on that target, whether mosquitoes can perceive stress in the things that they feed on, whether feeding on those organisms actually makes for more baby mosquitoes. So if the mosquitoes are preferring some organism that's stressed, does that help them make offspring? Do they make more of them faster? We're going to ask what those hormones do to host behavior, and then lastly, we're going to ask what happens to that virus in the bird, really trying to put all of those different pieces together to see whether this hormone makes for super spreading. So let's go through them one by one. How do you do these experiments? Well, I won't go through the details of how we manipulate the hormones, but some birds we're going to add a little bit of hormone, some birds we're going to add a whole bunch, and then other ones we're not going to change just for the sake of the manipulation, clean experimental design. We're going to put them all in a cage together. Then we're going to introduce mosquitoes to that cage, and we're going to wait overnight. We're going to come back the next morning, and this is the prediction that we have, that these guys, and I won't go into the details here, but a little bit of stress will do you good, a whole bunch is bad news, and the middle of the road is sort of the middle of the road. But if you've got all these birds in the cage together, how can you figure out from a mosquito that's chock full of blood, when you sort of just look at the blood in its abdomen, how do you know where that blood comes from? Well, we do the CSI approach, right? We just go in and DNA fingerprint these organisms. We look at the blood in the belly of the mosquitoes. We sort of use a particular region of the genome called microsatellites that are really, really variable, and then we can fingerprint those and go back and assign the blood in the belly of the mosquito to the bird that it fed on. A lot of times mosquitoes will feed on a bunch of different birds, but by and large we're 99.995% accurate. If the blood comes from this bird, we know it. So here's what we find. You can ignore all the words and just sort of jump right down here to the difference. If a bird is made to be stressed by putting these stress hormones in it, it's twice as tasty as the control individuals. So in other words, if you're at the barbecue and you've had a rough day or a rough week, you probably want an extra layer of repellent. Now, everybody asks me that. That's probably a big oversimplification. Unless one of you wants to volunteer, or I guess we need about the sample size of the whole room. If you all want to volunteer, I'll do the implantations and we can go back out to the facility and we'll run the experiment on people. But until then, I'm not really sure what you should do when stressed and going to cookouts. In general, though, it might be a rough idea to just go for it. All right, so we see that the mosquitoes are picking the stressed birds, but are they making a good choice? Maybe there's just some big signal coming from those birds, or maybe they're just bouncing around the cage like crazy and the mosquitoes can key in on them. When they choose, does it matter? Now again, a complicated figure, which biologists always like to do. The upshot here, if you want to squint at it, you want to talk statistics, I'm happy to do that. But the upshot here is that mosquitoes feeding on those birds that are really stressed, they laid big clutches fast. In other words, they did make good choices. They're making more copies of themselves and potentially elevating disease risk further. We've got more mosquitoes than we did just because they fed on those stressed birds. And they're appearing faster, which means biting even quicker. Doesn't really affect mosquito mortality, so it's helping the reproduction, not affecting their mortality. All right, so let's dig into the bird a little bit more, and we'll quickly go through behavior. There's actually not a very exciting story to tell there, but some surprises that might be interesting to folks. So if we do another version of that experiment I showed you before, we manipulate hormones, we put birds in cages by themselves this time, and we ask about how much these hormones influence their behavior. Yes, they bounce around a whole lot. And being insects, you might imagine that sometimes the birds are going to eat the mosquitoes. In fact, they do that. That's not the bird we work on, but if you look real carefully, we've got some sort of flying insect there that's being eaten or about to be. And that same thing happens here with the zebrafinches in these cages. But more often, we get a lot of this shuffling and tail flicking and things like that. Again, the upshot, cord is making these birds really more active. It's also making them overall much more defensive. So these stress hormones are making the birds of the type that you would sort of expect. They're able to swat and control mosquitoes like crazy. But again, I showed you last time, more court means more mosquito bites. When we do it in this context too, where there's only one bird in the cage with mosquitoes, if this bird has got those stress hormones in, it's still bad news for him. He's really defensive, but he's really bad at it. So it doesn't really help. It seems to increase their defense, but it's not protective. All right, so the thing that I think really matters most, because I've not yet shown you anything that's relevant to people directly, is what it means when we take this virus and we add it to the equation. So in other words, if we go into the system and we infect birds with West Nile virus, then add on the stress hormone level of manipulation, What does that mean for the amount of virus in circulation? What does that mean in the amount of risk in spilling that virus back into the human community or other animal populations? So what we're predicting is through time, there's some pretty complicated relationships, but I'm going to cut right to the chase here. It doesn't really matter how much virus you have in circulation until you go above this threshold, until you get up to a huge number of virions, 10 to the 4 virus particles per unit volume. You don't matter. This is why humans and other organisms don't make a difference. They never amplify virus enough to pass it on. So the question is, how much these stress hormones influence that difference? Do we end up with a situation with more virus in circulation? And the upshot is yes, in 2 different ways. So the birds that are physiologically stressed are making more virus, and they're doing it for much longer. But surprisingly, even though they're dying, and I won't show you these data, they're not dying at a rate, nor are they dying at a time that makes a difference. So what we're doing when we're putting virus and stress hormones into these birds is creating little virus factories that really don't seem to suffer very much, but are running the risk of getting exposed to mosquitoes quite a bit. And remember too from those earlier slides, not only are they making more virus, they're much more attractive to the mosquitoes, potentiating even more mosquitoes being made, and maybe ending up in this vicious cycle with stress exacerbating everybody's disease risk, even if it's happening in some individuals. All right, so let me give you some take-home messages, and then I'll shut up and answer questions if you have them. So this hormone is increasing mosquito feeding preference, it's increasing mosquito breeding performance, it's increasing defense, but again, it doesn't really work, and it's increasing the intensity and duration of these infections. So overall, it really does see that stress birds are more competent, and this stress hormone seems to be acting as some sort of mechanism that's generating a super spreading phenotype, a typhoid Mary type phenotype for West Nile virus in this particular system. All right, if this gets you going in Florida, infectious disease, especially viral infectious disease, how could it not? You could run over to Mosey. I have a collaboration with these guys in the NSF, especially if you have kids. We have a game show that they put on at least on Saturdays, but weekly, several times a day. You can check with them when it happens. It's kind of a Jeopardy, a half-an-hour Jeopardy show, informing you about infectious disease biology, but more just entertaining you and especially the kids on how that works. All right, lots of people to thank for work like this. I won't go through everybody's name, but happy to take any questions if you have them.
Did you primarily focus on Aedes and Anopheles, or did you look at any of the other breeds to see if they exhibited the same?
No, these experiments are pretty tricky, and mosquito husbandry is not my specialty. So we worked on one species of culex, and that was the only one that we used. Yeah, it's one of the more common vectors of West Nile, so we went with that one. The mosquitoes do really well in lab conditions too. It's a big part of the story. Anything else? Yep.
My wife, when she was expecting our child, insisted that mosquitoes wouldn't bite her. And then after the baby was born, they went back and went after her like she was the yummiest thing in the neighborhood. So, is there any sort of hormonal things that would chase mosquitoes?
It's quite possible. To our knowledge, we're really the first group to be asking questions this way. Now, I mean, mosquitoes, you know, they can pay attention to a lot of different signals, and there's quite a bit known about the amount of carbon dioxide in your breath being a strong indicator. In fact, some of the data that I showed you, the reason that these hormones are having the effect that they did, they influence your metabolic rate. So these birds may just be clouds of carbon dioxide telling the mosquitoes, oh, this is a tasty target over here. Same thing could potentially work with other hormones, but again, it's not something we've really thought a lot about as biologists yet. These hormones don't work in insects. So they don't have any role in the insect themselves. It's solely a vertebrate hormone. Anything else? Yeah, question again?
Did you try like different diurnal cycles, or did you see if like it was impacted based on time of day?
No, we didn't switch that around very much. So there's a lot of really cool things to do there. This particular mosquito feeds, like a lot of them do, when the sun goes up and when the sun comes down. So we tried to sort of maximize our ability to see the things we were looking for in this particular experiment, but a whole bunch of different versions you could check. Yep. All right, thanks guys.